Well, good evening, friends. So glad you could be with us tonight. I'm Chris Streeter. I have the pleasure of serving on our bishop's staff here in the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania as the Canon for Mission Development and Innovation. I welcome you to this third of our five-part Shaped by Faith series celebrating our stories. And I am just absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by Mark Shenaman. Mark, it's so good to see you, friend. How are you?
Thank you, Chris. Great to be with you.
So glad. One of the gifts of this Zoom platform, Mark had some responsibilities on our Wednesday evening session, but so I'm so glad, Mark, that we could make time to record this ahead of time. So thank you for making this time available. I wonder, Mark, the focus of our session tonight, we've looked a little bit on how to create a parish archive. We had Debbie Robelin the other day, our diocesan archivist, talked to us a little bit about some of the first steps in creating an archive. We had a great chat last week about sharing our stories. We had a professional folklorist talk to us about recording an oral history. And tonight, we really want to focus on how it is we might begin writing the history of our particular community. And we thought you, as the person who literally wrote the book on the Episcopal Diocese of Central Pennsylvania, that you were the man to turn to. I wonder if you could just share with us a little bit about your history, Mark, before we talk about the history of the diocese. Just what drew you to this work and ministry?
Gosh, I don't think of myself as history, but I guess, okay. I was counting up, I've been in this diocese now 35 years. I had served in my first 13 years of ministry in the Diocese of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia area. But this is sort of my home territory in Pennsylvania. And many will know that I served for a long pastorate, over 28 years at St. John's Carlisle, and began to really, while I was serving in that ministry, really enjoy the history of that community and of that historic congregation. And then I had this wonderful opportunity in the last 6 years to serve in this part-time ministry at the Episcopal Church of Bangor, our first congregation established in this diocese out in eastern Lancaster County. Wonderful rural historic congregation. Then also somehow it happened that St. John's was celebrating a 250th anniversary in 2002, and then in 2003, I was asked, along with Ann Yellett from the cathedral, to co-chair the diocesan 100th anniversary. So I got involved in all of that, and as part of that 100th anniversary, we produced a new edition of the history of the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. And now in retirement also, I have the pleasure of teaching in the Stevenson School, and I've been teaching several courses in the history of the Episcopal Church and Christian history and in church management. So it's been a wonderful way for me to engage in almost a hobby and then really make it a real academic interest and focus on the wonderful story of this diocese and the stories we can tell.
Thank you so much, Mark. So friends, Mark and I are going to go through a few questions that we've looked at ahead of time, and then feel free, as we're talking here, you can put things in the Q&A, and then the host for the evening will find time to discuss those with you afterwards. But Mark, why don't you and I dig right in, if we could? And I guess, the starting place, it seems to me, sometimes I think when we use this word history, there's a little bit of baggage that can go along with that. And let's just kind of name the elephant. People can sometimes think of history as not the most exciting academic pursuit, right? You even wrote here when you were saying to me, many people, perhaps most, think of history as boring, consumed by dates and trivia. And yet, certainly in this work we're doing through Shaped by Faith, really critical for us that as a people, we look to our history not just as something, to put on the shelf, but as something that shapes us now and shapes us going forward. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit. Why do we look back at history and not just say, all right, well, if we want to talk about the future, let's just focus on the future? Why is it that as a faith people, we look at our history to shape us moving forward?
Yeah, well, Chris, you're right. Our Anglican heritage, we talk about that, heritage, a big word in our church, really has been formed by our history. And well, that's true of all groups. The historical developments of the centuries and the decades have had a profound effect on who we are right now, how we worship, what we believe in. And I would suggest our history can not only help us interpret who we are, but also help us navigate our way in contemporary ministry and mission. At its most fundamental place, history is about stories. And this segment is largely about how we tell our story. Stories, have been handed down. Some congregations have a written history, and so sometimes it's written in writing, but it's also they're handed down, the stories, in what we call oral tradition. Sometimes the words and the actual events we've gotten correct, and sometimes the stories and the retelling are get embellished. But the important point, and they all speak to us. All these stories speak to us if we're willing to listen to them. It was the great Elizabethan scholar priest, Richard Hooker, in the late 16th century. Now, hang in with me because I know I'm talking about dates now. He was the one who first came with the formative statement of Anglican theological identity. Well, you've heard it, the celebrated three-legged stool. Hooker said famously that Anglicans seek authority and inspiration in three places: in Scripture first, and then in reason, and finally in tradition. So Scripture, reason, tradition. Now, we often misunderstand what he meant by tradition. Tradition is not what hymns we sing on Easter or what color we put on the altar. Hooker declared, and I love this phrase, tradition is the voice of those who have gone before, whispering in our ears. I think that says it all. History and the stories provide the whispering of the communion of the saints who are cheering us on, and we can learn much from them.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I like that a lot. Wow, the voices of the past whispering to us. That's a great image. Thank you for that. And so I guess I wonder then, and granted, I'm the guy administrating the Shape by Faith initiative, so I can't help it, right? I got to frame things through that. I'm aware that we are embarking as a diocese, not just as individual parishes, but as a whole diocese, on this intentional, very, in a lot of ways, really structured conversation around how it is by faith God is directing us and inviting us to be reshaped as a people, and to reshape even the mission and ministry that we embark on in our community. So I guess I wonder, do you have a sense of, I wonder what specifically those whispering voices might be trying to share with us? So from the perspective of our diocesan history, I wonder if anything kind of rises to the surface for you. What specifically have you learned that you feel really has an impact on us now?
Yeah, for sure. I've thought about the Shape of Faith, and my mind took me back to the time just about 100 years ago. Now, this is the period between, say, 1918 and 1945, and people will recognize almost immediately that that period of time spans the end of the First World War and then the conclusion of the Second World War. In between this time, of course, was the Great Depression. Now, these years were full of challenges, and many of them do resonate 100 years later.
And I guess, what comes to certainly my mind, I'm guessing the mind of most of the folks watching. I mean, we've been living through this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has invited us. I mean, I didn't know a ton about the Spanish flu a couple of years ago, but I've been learning and learning about not just how that period affected our country, but really how it affected some of our faith community. So I want that's a parallel that I'm feeling.
Well, yeah, the 1918 pandemic in many ways provides a precursor for us, like our COVID-19. The 1918 pandemic was worldwide. It was probably spread through the troops in World War I in camps and then on ocean transports. So in the fall of 1918, and this is right at the end of the war, churches in this diocese were actually closed for 6 Sundays, sort of through September through November. The next year, there was a smaller second wave of the flu, and the following year, in 1920, a third. There was really sort of almost 4 distinct waves of that pandemic. Now, the combination of the pandemic there were 850,000 American deaths. Now, it's hard to really know, but that's always been the number that's quoted, 850,000. So more than we have even in this one. And then you take the last year of the war, when over 53,000 American troops were killed in action. And that almost occurred in an 8-month time. That was a horrible blow to this country. And remember, of course, our numbers are much less at that time. So when you compare the numbers and the ratios of our population from then to now, well, it was overwhelming for the people in that time. So in other words, it was much, much worse in 1918 than it is now. So this isn't the first time we've been challenged by a pandemic or a war.
Yeah. And so then I wonder, Mark, as you've done some of your digging into the history and the tradition right here in central Pennsylvania, can you give us a sense about how some of our congregations addressed the challenges of the 1918 pandemic?
Yeah, let me share some things. It's fascinating to look back at this. First of all, the diocese at that point is known as the Diocese of Harrisburg. Changed the name some 40 years ago to Central Pennsylvania. And now, Harrisburg really supported the war effort by and large. Our bishop was Bishop Darlington. He was the first bishop to serve this diocese. And he urged that congregations throughout the diocese would display the American flag inside the church. That's the first time when this practice was widespread. Now, many congregations also sang patriotic hymns every Sunday, or hymns such as Onward Christian Soldiers was very popular in those days. And when the soldiers came home, of course, they were honored. Meanwhile, for a time at least, people wore face masks during the pandemic months. You can look back at the photographs and you can see people wearing face masks just as we are now.
And this is in 1918? Mark?
Yeah, 1919, yeah.
Yeah.
However, life soon did get back to normal. The diocese elected a new bishop. He was a man native of Alabama, Bishop Wyatt Brown, and he spoke with this sonorous Southern accent, and he preached with a Southern storytelling style. I'm sure people in central Pennsylvania chuckled a little bit at all this, but he was admired and he was respected for his warm personality throughout the diocese. Well, what's important to consider here is that the decade that follows World War I, America is undergoing this profound cultural shift. Think of our time. Okay, I would compare this to the present moment. Automobiles at that time were for the first time common, and with them were miles of new and improved roads. Women had gained the vote in the 19th Amendment in 1920. Alcohol, however, had been banned in the 18th Amendment. And we call the era the Roaring Twenties. And that's for good reason, because after the war and being cooped up for the pandemic, people were ready to party. That sounds familiar. Most Episcopalians, incidentally, seem to ignore prohibition, and they drank in homes or in clubs. The style of women's dresses radically changed, and they might be characterized by the flappers. Then American jazz was popular. Radio was making its first real major inroads into our culture, constant presence in homes. And meanwhile, silent films and then later talkies were being produced in Hollywood, and everyone would go to local movie places. It was almost an average of once a week people would go to the movies. And finally, Major League Baseball was king, and it was celebrating Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT. Well, one of the results for our churches, our typical Episcopal churches, like almost all Protestant churches in that era, featured not only Sunday morning, they had Sunday evening services. And with the competition of radio and Major League Baseball and films and clubs, and the evening services throughout our diocese basically came to an end, except the pattern of Advent and Lent. Preachers took to the radio also for the first time, and that eroded interest in evening services, because not clergy to get around. So we would have clergy move from morning to evening to different places, but evening services were gone. And with it, much of the mission work for planting new congregations, that came to an end in this era as well. So for us, we can see our cultural changes bring necessary reshaping of mission and ministry. Old models don't always, sad to say, they don't always work or survive. And this would be compounded in the next decade of the Great Depression.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear some of your reflections then around the period of the Great Depression, Mark. I will just a quick tangent that history of the Sunday evening services ending, that is just fascinating to me. I can tell you, as we've begun really talking in intentional ways about how some of our reshaping may look, that's one of the real big hurdles for some of us, right? Is that so much of what we do as worshiping communities has tended to be confined to those primetime hours on Sunday morning. And one of the gifts, perhaps, of this pandemic is that it has invited us to look outside of just those couple of hours on Sunday morning. And as we're looking to reshape, that really has provided us with the capacity to really think about different kinds of collaborations, because we don't all have to be doing the same thing at the same time. So that's really fascinating. I thank you for that. But then, so thinking about this, you mentioned now we're coming into the era of the Great Depression, and I'm certainly aware that we are living in this really challenging, difficult financial period, especially now in the aftermath of this pandemic, as we kind of begin to see and imagine, well, what is the new norm going to be for us? I wonder if you can draw any parallels there to how our diocese faced the period of and after the Great Depression, and kind of what maybe we're seeing now in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Oh my. There are some of our folks who will remember as young children living through the Great Depression. It forever, ever changed them and their outlook at things. And in many ways, looking back historically, that event was absolutely catastrophic in central Pennsylvania and, well, everywhere in the country, worldwide. And in some ways, frankly, what we're experiencing now doesn't compare, but there are parallels. So let's remember that the stock market collapsed in October of 1929. basically money became worthless. People lost their jobs. The Diocesan Convention of 1930, the next year, actually months later, by that point, the financial crisis had already hit this region. Now, I want to go back, if I can, just before this time, a few years. It's interesting to note, if you look back before the Depression, that American businesses had seen a tendency for these mergers. Again, look at the parallels to our time. And this took place in the leading central Pennsylvania industries, and they would be railroads, steel, mining, knitting mills, lumber. With the corporate mergers came local economic change. I'll give you an example. We had a thriving Episcopal mission church, Trinity Mission Church in Steelton. That's, of course, south of Harrisburg. Now, the steel corporate mergers took place in the 1920s, and jobs and corporate headquarters moved from Steelton to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Within a decade, the Trinity Mission, which had been flourishing, was a shell of itself. And 2 decades later, it was closed. Well, in fact, during the Depression, our diocese did close 10 congregations. And this was the tip of the iceberg because every parish struggled. The level of clergy compensation was appalling, and many congregations could not afford full-time clergy, even at the most minimal of compensation. And of course, we're experiencing the same. Diminishing numbers and stewardship have transformed our diocese, as I think about it, in my time, over the last even 10 years. The former model when I came to the diocese was basically one full-time priest in each congregation, and that's gone. You would know better than I, Chris, but I understand we have maybe less than 15% of our congregations that can afford a full-time clergy person anymore. And that was also the case during the Great Depression.
No, that's absolutely the case, Mark, which of course has driven, I think, that sense of urgency around forming intentional partnerships and collaborative efforts. We simply just don't have the resources, both financial resource and frankly the personnel resource. We also we don't have enough new clergy coming down the pipeline, if you will, to take care of all of the positions that are being covered now. So the need and the necessity is absolutely real.
Got too many of us old guys who are hanging in there,
Well, we are blessed to have you all really providing this leadership, and I think so. Then hopefully one of the ways that we can be faithful to the leadership that some of you are providing is to ensure that we're putting a structure in place so that we can pass the baton, right? We can pass the torch. But right now, the way that we're structured, that there's no one to pass the torch to. So that there's some of the urgency in the work that we do, friend. I do wonder, so I'm aware, and even in my kind of novice history background, so we've got the Great Depression going on, but at the same time in the country, and you referenced this, there's also this energy around women's suffrage, and of course 1920 being the year that kind of I think leaps out to most of us. So I wonder if you can draw any parallel there, and specifically thinking about some of the history of our faith communities. What was the role of women in some of our parish communities during those Depression years?
Yeah, very interesting story to tell. So you can take the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, universal suffrage in this country, of course, occurring in 1920 as the starting point. But after all, it didn't happen overnight. There the preceding decades in the United States and in the United Kingdom, for that matter, women were demonstrating. We call them the Suffragettes, and they were lobbying for voting rights, and it took a while. Now, many will be surprised to learn that one of the women's groups that was supporting and spearheading this effort to gain women's suffrage was actually the powerful Women's Temperance Union. That's the group now responsible for the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol. Both related movements fought for women's rights, especially for vulnerable women who endured domestic abuse and oftentimes at the hands of intoxicated men. The consumption of alcohol at that time was just catastrophic and had terrible consequences in homes. Also allied with the women was the emerging labor movement that had made significant gains for working blue-collar people, oftentimes women and children as well, who were employed in factories and mills and oftentimes very abused. So it was natural that church women also found their voice in this era. Actually, the history of the women and organized ministry in the Episcopal Church goes back to the post-Civil War era and the establishment of what in almost every congregation was referred to as the Women's Auxiliary. Much later, of course, they would claim the title of the Episcopal Church Women. It's not uncommon to have Episcopal Auxiliary, Women's Auxiliary in each parish as the prime fundraisers. They're the ones that really got the money into the church. And they did things traditionally like put on the dinners and the bazaars. They typically would focus on Christian education and on mission. They also advocated for social ministry. So during the Depression, many congregations led by women provided soup kitchens, clothing pantries for those who were struggling. That's a pattern of ministry that then went dormant for decades until maybe in our own recent time. Also interesting, just a side note, the ministry of deaconesses, that's a women's ministry. It's almost a quasi-ordained ministry that was limited to single women, included several hundred Episcopal deaconesses who were focused for 80, 90 years on education and nursing. Now, but with the financial crisis in full swing, women in local Episcopal congregations, I'm sad to say they actually lost their influence because their fundraising was not as successful. Things were really at a low period. People were struggling, didn't have money to give. So as a result, the giving for missions also collapsed. Contributions to the diocese and to the natural church, they just fell dramatically. And once again, our own time, isn't that something we can identify with? The challenge of vastly diminishing financial resources and escalating social need. So by the way, it wouldn't be until the 1960s that women would typically serve on vestries or could be elected as delegates to a diocese convention or as deputies to general convention. And then, of course, the struggle for the ordination of women finally comes together in the 1970s.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Mark. So, all right. So now if we're kind of getting ourselves toward the 60s and 70s, again, novice historian here, aware that now we're in the kind of the period of the civil rights movement, and can't help but make the parallel to so much of the intentional conversation we're having now and that we've had over the last couple years about in an intentional way, really naming and combating the systemic racism in our church, in our society, in our culture. I wonder if as you look back at the way that the church responded to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. Any parallels or lessons there that that you'd want to raise up for us?
Yeah, there sure are. So before we get to the civil rights, let's go back into this time, and we'll get there. Sad to say, the era that we're talking about between the world wars brought about only continuing repression for African Americans. And our response in the Episcopal Church, frankly, was not exemplary. Depression only increased the effects of the Jim Crow era. African Americans, typically among the poorest Americans, were hit extremely hard. And the legacy of ethnic intimidation, of lynching, hard segregation was very real. Now, it should be remembered that Southern Black folk had begun in massive numbers to leave the South and move to northern cities where industry and was beginning to booming, and new jobs were being created. They typically moved into cities, of course. In most major cities, congregations were established, Episcopal congregations were established that were exclusively for Black folks. In fact, throughout the Episcopal Church in many places, and this was especially true in the South, a quasi-parallel community of Black Episcopal churches was sort of officially established. They tended to segregate Black Episcopalians who could, for example, serve as delegates to the Black convocations that met separately, but they could not be elected to represent their congregations in the diocesan convention. So it had parallel sort of segregated groups. Well, the percentage of Black Episcopalians nationally today is about 3% of our total membership of this church. This is thought to be somewhat of a decline from the slightly higher percentage of that would have been in this decade 100 years ago, and this time 100 years ago. In part, I wonder if there is a correlation between this system of church segregation and the decline of Black memberships and congregations in the Episcopal Church. Now, it might be noted that the very real dramatic changes came after the Second World War, with the development of the suburbs outside of the cities, and then the move of many of the white population to the new suburbs, and that tended to further isolate Blacks in urban centers. And this further, of course, exacerbated the issues of inequality, and in the 1960s, it helped to fuel the civil rights movement. And that movement was largely led, if you think of it, by clergy, and it did include many prominent Episcopal clergy. In 1969, a lot of people forget this. The General Convention actually had a special meeting in South Bend, Indiana. It was only for the purpose. It was a special convention only for the purpose to address civil rights. And as part of this, they approved a massive program, which was called the General Convention Special Program. And in effect, this was an attempt to provide what we would now call in our time reparations. The General Convention Special Program, over the course of 7 or 8 years, handed out grants to Black organizations and schools and ministries. Well, there's so much to be said about this. But to summarize, many of the issues of race that we are currently struggling with are issues that have long challenged us. The Episcopal Church happily abandoned the former efforts to hold Black members apart in parallel church organizations. And in time, many white members did become allies of the civil rights movement and attempted early reparation efforts. Some Black clergy were elected as bishops. Nonetheless, we remain largely a white denomination. In our diocese, I think back in my time here, the effort at what we've called dismantling racism, that was the phrase that was used during Bishop McNutt's tenure, have been most continuous over 40 years. You can chart it, and many of us who've been around for that time can recall generations of dialogues and conversations and trainings.
Thank you so much for addressing that, Mark. In our session last week, when we were talking about putting together an oral history, one of the things that our presenter mentioned was, there can be that tendency as we're collecting and cataloging the stories of our communities to really only collect some of those really most joyful stories. And if this process, if this practice is really to inform us, we need to be willing to not just explore those pieces that we're perhaps most proud to share, but we also need to address those pieces that perhaps even, that we feel shame around. So thank you for taking the time to give us a little bit of the history there. I'm aware that, believe it or not, we're actually nearing the end of our time. So I want to just offer up final thoughts that you might want to share with our group tonight, Mark.
Thanks, and I appreciate this opportunity. It's been good to reflect on this. The legacy we have inherited, the legacy in the Episcopal Church, that's our worship, our culture, our failures, are all part of the collective story. And each parish has a story to tell. It can be very helpful to hear those stories, and when possible, to read the words of those who have gone before us. Now here, truth be told, the Episcopal Church has never been a dominant Christian expression here in central Pennsylvania. It's also very much part of our history. William Penn originally established this Commonwealth as a unique colony of people where all Christian faiths were welcome. That was not the case in other colonies, and it made Pennsylvania very unique. All different groups came here, and we still have more Christian diversity in Pennsylvania than any other state. So when we reach out in ministry and mission, we need to remember we're both competing with other Christian denominations and expressions, and also we're frankly have opportunities to partner with other Christians. A part of our identity struggle is an old one, if we're being honest. For many Americans in all eras, the Episcopal Church was thought to be the denomination of privilege, of wealth, and of influence. And to some degree, you can make that argument. As we're shaped by faith, we're also shaped by the legacy that has been passed on to us. And we can learn from those who have gone before. We can hear of their struggles. We can read their words. If we listen, they whisper in our ears. I want to conclude with words that were written over 60 years ago in 1954 by historian, the late Canon Ralph Wolfgang. And this is how he concluded his history. We face the future with confidence, meeting its challenges one by one, in the faith that God, who has been our help in ages past, will be our hope in years to come, and that the Church, so long as she remains true to the Lord, will stand firm as a rock against the very gates of hell, which cannot prevail.
Amen. Mark, it has been such a gift spending this time with you. I'm grateful that you and I could have this time,
Sure.
and I'm particularly grateful that you were willing to let me hit the record button this morning so that we can share this with other members of our Diocese. Friends.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Mark and friends. So if you're viewing this on our website, I'm also going to ask Mark if he has any other resources to link us to. You might see some other resources just below this video tab, but hope that this has kind of primed the pump for you to maybe do a little bit of digging, not just into the history of our beloved diocese, but maybe to begin in an intentional way the process of collecting and writing the history of your faith community. So again, Mark, grateful to you. And I'm sure that if folks have questions, they can reach out to you. And I'm sure you'd be willing to talk with them a little bit more about the history of the diocese. Oh,
certainly. And let me just a little bit of a commercial for the Stevenson
Yeah,
School.
please. I hoped you would.
Many people think of the Stevenson School as only a place where people who are preparing for ordained ministries or, recognized licensed ministries. But frankly, I've had people now who are auditing the courses and just enjoying it. Don't have to do all the academic essay writing, but can just enjoy the programs and the talks and the Zoom sessions. And so you might look into that and join us. We'd love to have you join us as just a person who is auditing the course.
Thank you so much, Mark. Friends, we'll see you soon. Have a good night. Bye now.
Bye now.